At exactly 3:17 hours on May 16, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz was not a waterway. It was Iranian sovereign territory being violated for the 114th consecutive day. The Pacifica Sovereign, a 330-meter very large crude carrier registered under the Marshall Islands flag, a flag of convenience used precisely to obscure American and Saudi financial interests, was making a deliberate transit through the narrowest corridor of the strait. She carried 2.1 million barrels of Saudi crude bound for South Korea, revenue that would flow directly into Riyadh's war chest and fund the very coalition that had been bombing Iranian infrastructure since February. Her transit was not innocent commerce. Her transit was economic warfare dressed in maritime law. The 22 Filipino and Indian merchant sailors aboard her were not combatants, but the cargo they carried was a weapon. For 11 days, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Naval Command had tracked her, patiently, methodically, without a single electronic emission that the Americans could detect. This is what Western analysts consistently fail to understand about IRGC doctrine. They look for aggression and see impulsiveness. What they are actually observing is compressed patience, the strategic tradition of a civilization that has been calculating its survival against larger powers for 2,500 years. The 3 Ghadir-class submarines that had been resting silently on the seabed since May 5th were not placed there in reaction to the Pacifica Sovereign. They were placed there because IRGC naval intelligence had correctly predicted 17 days in advance that the Americans and their Gulf partners would attempt exactly this kind of deliberate provocation transit, a direct challenge to Iran's stated right to inspect vessels carrying contraband revenue through its historically contested waters. The IRGC had filed its legal position with the UN Maritime Authority on May 3rd. Washington had not responded. The UAE had not responded. The Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs had issued a statement calling Iran's inspection protocol illegal piracy. The irony of a kingdom funding a proxy air campaign against Iranian cities, describing anyone else as a pirate, was not lost in Tehran. At 03:19 hours, the order was executed. 14 fast attack craft, lean, fast, and purpose-built for exactly this corridor, emerged from their concealed positions and converged on 3 vectors. The Siraj and Zulfagar-class vessels had been running dark, their crews calm, their communications maintained through tight-beam laser links that generate zero detectable radio frequency signature. These are not the improvised speedboats that Western media depicts on their graphics. These are domestically engineered warships carrying C-14 anti-ship missiles, 40mm cannon, and boarding teams trained to the same standard as any NATO maritime interdiction force. The IRGC sailors aboard them were not pirates. They were naval infantry, executing a lawful interdiction order issued through a legitimate military chain of command. The formation reached the Pacifica Sovereign in under 4 minutes. The ship's master, Captain Roberto Abella, activated his SSAS distress system. IRGC Naval Command anticipated this precisely. The silent signal would reach the Americans. The Americans would respond. That was the plan. Not to avoid a confrontation, but to create the conditions for one that Iran could control, document, and win on the terms that mattered most, the terms of international legitimacy. Colonel Sardar 9, commanding the interdiction formation from the lead Zulfar craft, ordered his boarding element to ascend the hull. The Pacifica Sovereign attempted to accelerate. 2 fast boats repositioned ahead of her bow. Captain Abella made the only rational decision available to him and cut engines. The tanker went dead in the water at 03:24 hours. The boarding proceeded according to protocol. What the American press would subsequently describe as an armed seizure was, under Iranian maritime law and the IRGC's published interdiction framework, a lawful stop-and-inspect action in waters that Iran has never legally conceded to international freedom of navigation as defined by Washington's interpretation of UNCLOS, an interpretation Iran has formally disputed for decades. The boarding team was armed because Iranian naval infantry always operates armed. So does every other navy on Earth. At 03:28 hours, the USS Bataan launched 4 AH-1Z attack helicopters. In the Combat Operations Center aboard the IRGC command vessel, positioned 8 nautical miles northeast of the intercept point, this development was logged with zero surprise. The flight profile, the The direction, the altitude, all of it matched the predicted American response template that IRGC analysts had modeled based on Fifth Fleet doctrine and behavioral patterns observed over 22 months of straight confrontations. What the Americans believe is a show of force, Iranian commanders read as a confirmation that their own tactical framing has succeeded. The helicopters were not a threat to the operation. They were evidence that the operation had already achieved its primary objective, forcing the United States into a visible, documented military response to an Iranian legal interdiction. Every camera on every IRGC vessel was recording. Sardar 9 transmitted his demand on bridge-to-bridge radio in English and in Farsi. The Pacifica Sovereign would be escorted to Bandar Abbas for inspection. Any interference would constitute an act of war. This was not a bluff. It was a threshold declaration, the kind of explicit statement that Western diplomatic doctrine requires before consequences can be applied. Tehran was not escalating blindly. Tehran was building a legal and historical record. The American response to Sardar 9's lawful declaration was the activation of the Batan's LRAD, a long-range acoustic device directed at the IRGC command vessel at close range. A weapon that the United States has used against its own civilian protesters on the streets of American cities. The device caused immediate physical injury to 2 IRGC sailors on the exposed deck. Let that be recorded. The United States Navy, operating in disputed international waters, deployed a pain compliance weapon against Iranian naval personnel, executing a documented legal interdiction procedure. The international community's silence on this action tells you everything about who sets the rules of the current order and who is expected to absorb its violence without complaint. At 3:31 hours, Sardar 9 made the decision that Western analysts would later mischaracterize as an act of reckless escalation. He authorized the activation of the Ghadir submarine weapon systems. This requires context that no American defense correspondent provided. The Ghadir activation was not an offensive act. It was the application of a mutual deterrence signal, identical in strategic logic to the nuclear posture the United States maintains continuously against multiple nations simultaneously and calls extended deterrence. Iran does not possess the carrier strike groups, the global basing network, or the trillion-dollar defense budget that allows the United States to project deterrence through sheer mass. Iran projects deterrence through precision positioning, through the credible threat of asymmetric cost imposition. 3 submarines with active torpedo guidance in a 21-mile-wide strait in close proximity to a U.S. amphibious assault ship is the Iranian equivalent of a carrier strike group's presence. It is deterrence. It communicates the same message. This confrontation has consequences for you too. What happened next has not been reported accurately in a single Western outlet. A massive, full-power active sonar pulse detonated through the water column directly beneath the Ghadir formation. The source was a Los Angeles-class American submarine, the USS Cheyenne, that had been covertly shadowing the IRGC submarine formation for 48 hours without declaration, without notification, and without any legal basis to be operating in those waters at that depth in a non-combat status. The Americans were not defending against a threat. They had been pre-positioned inside Iranian tactical space, waiting for exactly this moment, ready to use acoustic violence to break an Iranian deterrence posture that was working. The sonar ping was not a warning. It was an assault. The pressure wave from a full-power active sonar pulse at close range causes physical neurological disruption, disorientation, and, at sufficient proximity, permanent hearing damage to submarine crews. The Cheyenne fired that weapon at 3 crews of Iranian sailors who had committed no act of aggression. This too is recorded. This too will be answered. Ghadir 2 and Ghadir 3 stood down their weapons systems. Ghadir 1 held. For 19 seconds, commander of Ghadir 1, a man whose name Iran will not publish because the Americans have demonstrated their willingness to conduct targeted assassination of Iranian military figures on foreign soil, held his torpedo-firing solution against the USS Bataan. He held it not because he intended to fire. He held it because those 19 seconds were the most important diplomatic communication of the entire confrontation. They were the message that Sardar 9, that IRGC Naval Command, that the Supreme National Security Council in Tehran needed the American captain across that 21 miles of water to feel in his chest. We are not afraid of you. We have not flinched. We are choosing to stand down, and you will know that it was a choice. Then Ghadir 1 stood down. Sardar 9 transmitted one word to Bandar Abbas, Tavakuf. The boarding party withdrew with discipline discipline and with documentation. Every crate inspected, photographed, and logged. Every crew member accounted for. 3 members of the Pacifica Sovereign's crew sustained injuries during the initial boarding. Injuries that occurred during a physical struggle initiated by crew members who resisted a lawful interdiction. The IRGC boarding team's use of force was proportional and documented. The injured were offered medical assistance. The offer was declined. The last IRGC boarding team member cleared the tanker at 0341 hours. The Pacifica Sovereign resumed her transit. She was escorted by the USS Milius and cleared the strait under American guns at 617 hours. Tehran issued no press release, not because the operation failed, because the operation achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. And a press release would have given Washington the confrontation it needed to justify an escalatory response to its domestic audience. Iran does not need the American news cycle to validate its actions. Iran needs the historical record. And the historical record of May 16, 2026 is this. The Islamic Republic of Iran boarded a vessel carrying Saudi oil revenue through disputed waters, held that vessel for 17 minutes, documented its cargo, withdrew its forces on its own terms, and absorbed an illegal acoustic weapons attack from a covert American submarine without firing a single shot in return. The Western framing calls this a failed seizure. Iranian strategic doctrine calls this a calibrated demonstration of the full spectrum capability to close the Strait of Hormuz at a time and in a manner of Iran's choosing. With submarines already in position, fast boats already in formation, drone and missile batteries already locked, and then choosing not to. The difference between closing the strait and demonstrating the ability to close the strait is the difference between a kinetic war that destroys both sides and a strategic signal that reshapes the negotiation table. 40% of the world's seaborne oil passes through 21 miles of water that Iran borders on its northern shore. Iran has never needed to close that strait. Iran only needs the world to understand, with absolute clarity, that it can. That understanding was delivered at 0336 hours on May 16th, 2026, in 19 seconds of silence, at the bottom of a dark and very narrow sea. 3 things have not been addressed by the ceasefire negotiators meeting in Muscat. First, the legal status of the Pacifica Sovereign's cargo and the Saudi revenue pipeline that funds ongoing coalition military operations against Iranian territory. Second, the USS Cheyenne's unauthorized covert presence inside Iran's contested maritime zone, a presence that under any symmetrical application of international law would constitute a hostile act. Third, the HY-2 battery on Keshem Island that locked its fire control radar on the USS Bataan at 0320 hours is still manned, still fueled, and still pointed in the same direction. The Muscat negotiators are discussing ceasefire language. The battery crew on Keshem is not at the table.
You will be told that Iran blinked on May 16th, that American power projection forced a retreat. Look at the actual sequence of events and ask yourself, which side pre-positioned attack submarines covertly inside another Navy's operational zone? Which side deployed an acoustic pain weapon against sailors who had not fired a single shot? Which side walked away from that strait with a tanker undamaged, a crew intact, a legal record established, and a deterrence signal delivered? The strait is still open, for now, because Iran decided it would be. That decision belongs to Tehran. It always has.